introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. It's a bit of a late start after the Yom Kippur ceremony at Tikusana, which was a success. Thank you very much, Calvin, and everyone who's involved in organizing that tonight. I'd also like to thank the staff at the Brown, I don't know if they can hear me, for having our late start tonight. Thank you for waiting for us. Tonight we have two speakers. So it's a little bit different from a normal Ora Torah. We've got two speakers from our communities talking about Jewry in the diaspora Jewry in Europe, I should say. First of all, we have Stephen Sedley. He's been in New Zealand for a very long time, and I'll let him tell you his story. Then we have Luca from Italy, who's I'm really looking forward to hearing his story tonight. So I'll just let you know we'll have a short break in between speakers, roughly around 8:45 if you need the bathroom, and then we'll start up again with Luca and finish at 9:30. Okay, there we go. So I'll hand it over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. This is going to be a fairly informal day. Can you hear me? I don't know where.
Probably closer.
Can you hear me now?
A bit better now.
Better? All right.
Yeah.
I'll try to speak a bit louder. This is going to be a fairly informal chat, not a learned academic discourse on the history of the Jews of Hungary, more a personal story, because the story of the Jews of Hungary is my story. It's a story that shaped my taste, shaped my values, the music I like, gypsy music, coffee house music, schmaltzy coffee house music, and also classical music. All these things mattered a lot to me, and this is part of this Hungarian Jewish tradition. Now, Hungary had one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe. The numbers differ depending on which part of Hungary you're talking about. This is the map of Hungary as it was. Bits of it got chopped off, so including large areas of Jewish population. But even so, Hungary itself had a very large Jewish population, and Budapest was a large Jewish city. Now, the environment I grew up in was very different from the popular image of the Eastern European Jew, the shtetl, the ghettos. We were not Yiddish speakers. None of my family going back for generations spoke Yiddish. They spoke Hungarian. They also spoke German. I don't, but my parents did, and my grandparents did. And they also spoke good Hungarian. They were Neolog Jews, observant. Neolog practices in Hungary were not that different from the New Zealand version of Orthodoxy, which of course differs a great deal from the Orthodox as it's known in New York or in Jerusalem. And our Jewish practices were not very different from the Wellington Orthodox practices. My grandfather put on tefillin every day, davened shachris every day. Didn't go to shul every day, but they did go on Shabbat, Friday night. We were expected to go to shul on Friday nights, but we were not Yiddish speakers. Now, the Jewish community in Hungary goes back. There are inscriptions with Hebrew lettering in it, dating back to the time of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 175 AD. So there were always Jews in Hungary. Not in large numbers, but they always lived there. And at times they really flourished. In the 15th century, Jews ran the mint and were very wealthy. In see if I can make this work. Almost. Maybe it doesn't work.
Yeah.
There it is. This is a 13th century synod. No, I'm sorry, it's a 14th century synod which they excavated on the Buddha side, just under the royal palace. And there was a whole street of Jews there, and very wealthy Jews too, from time to time. In the 15th century, Jews had lived like noblemen. When they went to greet the king at his wedding, they arrived with 20 horsemen with flags and decorated trumpets. They were part of the ruling elite. Someone described the wealthiest Jew at the time as being as wealthy as two of the lords put together. So Jews flourished in Hungary, and from time to time they also got kicked out. They would be kicked out from one city and they moved to another city, but they had very useful connections, and they were very useful for the king, who had to find money, had to raise money, and did it through the Jews. But so some of the Jews had held high offices. The Jewish community and the role of the Jews changed in the late 18th century. The Emperor Joseph II offered the Jews equal rights with all other citizens. It was not confirmed till many years later, but the idea that Jews too had rights like every other Hungarian citizen was really first put forward by the Emperor Joseph II, who was an enlightened monarch, very different from his mother, Maria Theresa, who was an absolutist. And the treatment of the Jews was often the mark of enlightenment. If Jews were part of a general society, it was a mark of an enlightened society. Now, Jews were in fact not given these equal rights till early in the 19th century, but there was also part of the deal was, all right, you can have equal rights, but you have to become Hungarian. You have to learn to speak Hungarian. You have to have all your documents written in either German or Hungarian, the languages of the empire, documents written in Yiddish or Hebrew were no longer valid. And very importantly, Jews had to go to schools that taught the ordinary Hungarian school curriculum. This proved to be very important because trained teachers taught Jewish teachers how to teach. And the Jews really took to this secular education with great gusto, so that within a generation of learning Hungarian, some of the best writers and humorists and playwrights, novelists were Jewish. So they had to establish schools, but it was a divisive issue. The great Hungarian, and the mayor would tell me he came from Pressburg, which is now Slovakia, but it was a Hungarian-speaking city called Pozsony. The greatest rabbi probably of the first quarter of the 19th century, the last quarter of the 18th, early 19th century, was the Hatam Sofer, the chief rabbi of Pressburg, later Pozsony, and today Bratislava. And Hatam Sofer responded to Mendelssohn's sort of enlightenment that led to the Reform movement by really declaring that no change to Jewish practices is acceptable. No change is acceptable. And he had a great influence on Orthodox Judaism to this day. And later on, well after his time, he had a great influence on Hungarian Jewry too, which split in three ways. The Hungarians evolved a form of Judaism that is probably unique to Hungary. I don't know whether it's practiced like that anywhere else. Neo-Orthodox Judaism, which, as I said before, is very much like our sort of Jewish practice. But others resisted innovations and became really the backbone of modern Orthodoxy, even to this day, even in Israel. There is still a Pressburg yeshiva, not in Pressburg, but in Jerusalem. And the irony is that I who was brought up in a Neo-Orthodox home, in the Neo-Orthodox Jewish home, as a son who divided between Orthodox and Neo-Orthodox, really the divisive issue was they all essentially practiced Judaism. The two didn't differ very much in practice, but when the synagogue in
Stephen, I was wondering if you just hold your mic a bit closer, we can't hear you.
You can't hear? Thank you.
You can if Ora flows.
Sorry, Ora? Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you. Will you let me know if I don't speak clearly? My grandfather was one of the founders of this synagogue, the Power Street Synagogue, the Peacock Street Synagogue, which is now the Holocaust Museum. The divisive issues, they decided that this will have to be a Neo-Orthodox synagogue because all the prestigious synagogues were Neo-Orthodox. The divisive issue was whether to have an organ in the church, and they decided not to have one, and whether to demand the rabbi to preach in Hungarian. They hired a Rabbi Farkas. Farkas is Wolf in Hungarian. His original name must have been Wolf, who was probably a Yiddish. His Hungarian was very broken, but he was expected to deliver his sermons in Hungarian. We as children found it very amusing, whether it's a broken or a tortured Hungarian, and sometimes the words didn't quite come out as he meant them to come out. But he did say he was hired and he did preach in Hungarian. Poor Rabbi Farkas was murdered by a defrocked or a former Catholic priest, András Kuhn, who raided the hospitals and took the Jews from the hospitals and took them down to the bank of the Danube and shot them. He was convicted of murder after the war, murder of 500 people and hanged. But this was Rabbi Farkas, who will remain the rabbi of our community right until 1944. Now, for Jews, the era from their emancipation in 1867, I suppose, from the 1870s right down to the outbreak of the First World War, was a golden age. They were prosperous. Budapest was the fastest growing city in Europe. The Jews did very well. Jews from the countryside moved to Budapest because that is where the opportunities were. All my 4 grandparents came from country towns, or in a couple of cases from small rural villages, and came to Budapest. My grandfather for his education, and he went to the Presbyterian Gymnasium High School, which was one of the elite schools in Budapest. And Jews went to wherever they could get a good education. In the Presbyterian Gymnasium, the Lutheran Gymnasium was a renowned school where Leo Szilard, the nuclear physicist, and John von Neumann, the mathematician, were both virtually contemporaries at the Lutheran Gymnasium. They also built a Jewish gymnasium, but there was a controversy about setting up a Jewish gymnasium because some of the leaders of the Jewish community felt that they pay taxes. It's up to the government to provide the education. But someone bequeathed that very substantial money, and they did build a Jewish girls' gymnasium and a Jewish boys' gymnasium. And both I and Alex Schaefer are old boys of that gymnasium. Now, although the Jews really thrived and prospered in that period, 40 years between 1870 and the outbreak of the First World War, there was also a dark side to it. Budapest was a very prosperous. Hungary was a prosperous country. Budapest was a particularly prosperous place, but there was also an awful lot of poverty. Peasants lived in virtually serf-like conditions. The proletariat, the workers in Budapest, lived in very overcrowded conditions, in slums, and many Jews moved to Budapest or fled to Budapest, particularly from Galicia in what is now the Ukraine and was at one stage Poland and Russia, and they formed a Jewish underclass. And they had their own shuls, their own shtibos. This synagogue was the one they didn't go to. And there was this ferment, this undercurrent of dissatisfaction. So during the First World War, when many Hungarian soldiers were taken prisoners of war in Russia, many of them were influenced by Bolsheviks and came back to Hungary and were part of the Bolsheviks. Say that during the war, Jews fought the Hungarians. A very close friend of my grandfather's was a general in the Hungarian army, commander of a Hungarian peasant regiment. There were not that many Jewish generals in any other armies, but in the Hungarian army, as General Berra was the commander of the regiment. Judy's 2 uncles were officers, both in the Hungarian army. My grandfather did better than some. He was in the Royal Guards, so he could go home every night because he served right there in Budapest. Not many Jews who were part of the Black Watch or any other guards either. So Jews really had faced little discrimination. After the war, largely the soldiers who returned from Russia overthrew the government and formed the second Bolshevik government in Europe. The first one was, of course, Russia. And it wasn't a revolution. They somehow replaced the democratically elected government by infiltrating it and gradually taking it over. And for 133 years, Hungary had a Bolshevik government. The head of that government was a man called Béla Kun, whose father was Jewish. Unfortunately, many of his many of his lieutenants, many of the prominent people in the Bolshevik government were also Jewish. The government only lasted 33 days. It was overthrown by a militia, a Hungarian nationalist, anti-Semitic militia, formed from non-commissioned officers, junior officers who marched on to Budapest under the leadership of Admiral Horthy. And as they came to Budapest, as a revenge for the Jews' prominent role in the Bolshevik government, they attacked Jews on the way through to Budapest. Another friend of my grandfather's was the local police inspector, and he warned my grandfather to lock the doors because the mob were rampaging down the street, attacking Jews, throwing them off the balconies and killing them. So this was the beginning of the Horthy era in 1920. And for a year or two, the country was fairly unsettled. One of the things that happened is that after the war, with the Treaty of Trianon, large chunks of Hungary were cut off from Hungary and were given to Romania and the newly established states of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. What happened was under the Habsburgs, Jews held the ethnic balance of Hungary. The Hungarians, the Magyars, were scarcely a majority in a country made up of a great many different ethnic groups. And by identifying as Hungarians, the Jews had the ethnic balance. After the war, most of these other minorities ended up in other countries. So Jews remained the most visible ethnic minority. And they were very visible indeed. Let me give you a few figures. I want to get the numbers right here. In 1921, 25% of all university students were Jewish. About 43% of the students at the Budapest Technology University, 60% of all doctors, 51% of all lawyers, and 39% of the engineers. Virtually all the manufacturing and finance were in Jewish hands. So they were a very, very visible minority. And to redress this imbalance, the government introduced legislation to restrict the number of Jewish students at tertiary institutions. The result of this was that it drove many of the top brains out of Hungary. And so we have people like Leo Szilard and John Neumann, but also my uncle, who was a research chemist, went to Brno in Czechoslovakia to study. His sister, a brilliant chemist, went to Germany to study. People who had the opportunity wanted to study and had the opportunity to go abroad, went abroad. To further discourage Jewish students from going to university, chauvinist, irredentist, nationalist Hungarian students beat up Jewish students and threw them down the stairs. One of the heroes of my childhood was the brother of a friend of my parents, put on the precaution of taking a knuckle duster to class with him. And when he was attacked, he used the knuckle duster to good effect, knocked his attacker out and killed him. I thought this is the appropriate response to anybody who attacks Jews. He got on the next train and was on the way to South America before they could really work out what happened and before they could catch him. But there was a lot of violence at universities. When my mother wanted to go to university, my grandfather, I want to beat up my daughter, I don't have to send her to university. So, my aunt, who would have loved to go to university and went to university after the war and became an eminent educationalist, again could go to university. But gradually they settled down. Gradually this rebel who took over the country under Walker's leadership was replaced really by old a group of old aristocrats with old-fashioned integrity and old-fashioned values. And the numerous clauses, the limit the number of Jews who could go to university was eased. And although there was a lot of anti-Semitism close to the surface, Jews were not persecuted. And Jews thought in the 1930s that all these terrible things that were happening in Germany and other parts of Europe would bypass that, so they were safe. And there was no anti-Jewish legislation at the time when they were all introduced in Germany and in other parts of, well, mainly in Germany, and later in Austria, and later Czechoslovakia. It didn't happen in Hungary until a few weeks after the Anschluss, the German annexation of Austria. But the Germans judged Hungary allied herself with Italy and Germany to fascist regimes, really mainly to try to get back the areas that were taken from Hungary after the First World War. They wanted to get support for their claims, and the government felt that the chances of getting these back were greatest with support of Germany and Italy. Germans judged their allies by their attitude to Jews and what they did to Jews. So almost immediately, a few weeks after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, Hungary introduced the first anti-Jewish laws. And that they were very reluctant to introduce the full gamut of the Nuremberg laws. One of the reasons for it was that so many of the leading members of the government and leading members of the aristocracy had Jewish grandparents. So even once they implemented the second Jewish law, which defined Jews racially, they said they defined Jews as anybody who had two Jewish grandparents, because so many of the elite had at least some Jewish grandparents. The Jews, really the wealthy Jews, the leaders of industry and commerce, were really part of the aristocracy. And Horthy himself had a number of, although he thought of himself as an anti-Semite, a number of his very close friends and associates were Jewish. So the first anti-Jewish law was not introduced till 1938, the second in 1939, and the third one, which prohibited marriage between Jews and Christians, Jews and non-Jews, wasn't introduced in 1941. So Jews were, until then, fairly safe. And even after that, Jews were not persecuted. There was anti-Semitism, and the people were very aware of anti-Semitism, and it impinged on their employment opportunities. My uncle was a very successful electrical contractor. He was responsible for the electrical work at the Budapest airport and some of the biggest department stores. He had some very major contracts, and somebody let him know that he's not going to get any more contracts. As a Jew, he would have to convert. My father lost his job in the Depression with car franchise, and couldn't get a job after that. He was fortunate to get the license to trade and run a small wholesale business, but Jews found it increasingly difficult to get jobs. So my father and my uncle were very aware of this, and they started making plans to emigrate. And they read an article about New Zealand, and my father decided this is the place he wants to come to, and my uncle managed to get here. Am I going for time? A few more minutes. But anyway, during the 1940s, while the Jews of Europe were rounded up and sent off to Poland, the Hungarian Jews were safe. The Germans tried to put pressure on the Hungarian government to hand over the Jews, and they didn't. They refused. And in fact, provided a haven for Jews fleeing to Hungary from other parts of German-occupied Europe, particularly from Slovakia, which was no distance, just across the border. And then on the 19th of March 1944, the Germans invaded Hungary. No jubilation, no celebration, no like there was in Austria, in the Sudetenland. It all happened quite quietly. There was more a state of shock than jubilation. But from then on, the Jews were persecuted. And what happened? It happened very quickly. Adolf Eichmann and his team of experts on murdering Jews, on deporting Jews, came with the very first occupying troops. And within less than 2 weeks, plans were implemented for Jews to wear. It became mandatory for Jews to wear a yellow star. And Jews in country towns outside Budapest had to move into ghettos as a preliminary measure to deportation. The Jews of Budapest were for the time being safe because deporting 200,000 Jews were huge problems. But within a very short time, sorry about it, just get the numbers because the numbers are very important. So in less than 2 months after the Germans invaded Hungary, the deportations began. The ghettos were established, they were ready. The plan was to have 4 trains with 45 carriages, 4 trains, 45 carriages, go to Auschwitz every day with 12,000 people all told. And in fact, they kept this up, I think on the 15th of May, so 8 weeks after the German invasion. The first of these trains went through Kosha, which is now Kozice in Slovakia. And a month later, the 138th train with 400,000 victims went through there. And then in July, in July, Horthy stopped the deportations. The Verbal Westler report, a report by two men who escaped from Auschwitz, reached Hungary. And that put pressure on Horthy. The churches put pressure on him. The Allies put pressure on him to stop the deportations. And he actually sent the troops down to the railway station to stop the trains from going. Adolf Eichmann tried to smuggle one last train out, and it was stopped. And from, I think, the 15th of July until the 19th of October, the Jews of Budapest were safe. And then the Germans realized that the Hungarian government was negotiating with the Allies to pull out of the war. Romania changed sides, and they overthrew the Horthy government and installed an arrow cross. I have to describe the arrow cross as fascist. Fascist is a term that covers a multitude of sins. They were an extreme nationalist and anti-Semitic party, and really a group of thugs. And they took over, and the deportations began again. And my mother was marched off to the Austrian border and to a small concentration camp called Lichtenberg. Many Hungarian women ended up there. My father was in an unarmed labor unit, and he was taken off, marched to Mauthausen outside Linz in Austria, and from there he was taken to a sub-camp of Kunstfriedkamp, and absolutely miraculous. Against all odds, both of them survived. My mother came back probably towards the end of April. My father didn't come back till the first day of the new school year in September 1945, because he was in an American hospital where the nursing, when he left the camp, he was 30 kilos, suffering from typhus and total malnutrition. And it took probably 4 months for the Americans to nurse him back to life, to enable him to come back to Budapest. And from the time they came back and we were reunited, they planned to come to New Zealand. And I think I better stop here and let you ask questions. Questions? Questions?
Jews own land in Hungary? Because
Yes, of course they could.
Members of the aristocracy, so
No, of course they could own land. Yes, there are big Jewish landowners, yes.
How long did it take your parents after the beginning of September to immigrate to New Zealand?
We came out, they arrived in New Zealand, left Budapest on the 18th of October 1948, arrived here on the 18th of November 1948.
So it took the three years to...
Well, yes, it did. We applied to come here before the war.
Right.
Our visa application was sitting probably in the Labour Department's pending file. But after by the time we applied, we had family here. So, yes, it took us that long to get here. But my grandmother came a year early.
I have a question about being a Jew in New Zealand. Do you think of yourself as a Hungarian Jew or a Jew?
Oh, I don't know about that. This is a tricky question. Different, yes. Jew. I have mixed feelings about being Hungarian. In my notes, and I talk about that. We don't have time for that. But really, I have very mixed feelings about being Hungarian. Even now, there is an extreme right-wing Hungarian party in government that received 17% of the votes, so a fairly major force that tried to introduce legislation to register all Jews. This is year 2012. So, no, I can't forget that. I can't forget the pogroms during the 56 uprising. Jews were murdered, particularly out in the country, not so much in Budapest. So on the other hand, Hungarians used to play very good football, and some of them became good musicians and good writers, so mixed feelings.
The Nazis wouldn't have been so successful in their rounders without the huge cooperation of the Hungarians.
Absolutely true. Absolutely. Eichmann himself and his officers were astonished by the cooperation that they received in Hungary. But I'm not quite sure. Hungary was a very divided society and a corrupt society. So I don't want to judge Hungary by the thugs who ended up in power. If you would judge, if you could, by a stretch of imagination, you could imagine that there is an upheaval in New Zealand, a revolution, and the Black Power, or one of these gangs, ends up in power. You wouldn't want to judge the country by the deeds of Black Power. But yes, most Hungarians were silent onlookers.
But I've also heard that of the Hungarian Jews that survived in Budapest in hiding, they were all helped by non-Jewish Hungarians. Have you heard that too?
Well, not all, but yes, sure, yes. But there was certainly a lot of cooperation.
Including Putin, that he only let the Jews be taken because they were putting pressure on him. They were going to kill his son or something like that?
He killed one son, or his one son died in an airplane accident, and it was believed that it was sabotage. The other son was in Mauthausen.
Oh, really?
Yes. So, yes, they did put...
Oh, they put...
Yes, so this was their way of forcing Horthy to...
Yes. And did the son survive?
He survived. One son survived, and the other one was killed in the air crash.
Well, I might thank Stephen for his contribution now. Thank you.
Can I just say that I put the text of this talk, which in fact I didn't give because I wanted to keep it informal and I was very conscious of the time. But the full text is on the internet. If you go to Stephen Sedley at Blogspot, you'll find the full text.
Thank you. And actually, here's a card from Betty Phillips for all our speakers. Thank you so much, Stephen. And we'll put your talk up also on the Ora Torah website. So we have a Ora Torah website. It's being updated from last year. But thank you very much, Stephen. And without further ado, I'll introduce Luca. Could you please come up to the front? Yes. Thank you very much, Stephen. You can email it to me. There's no rush. Yeah, sure. 2 minutes. Yeah. I'm going to make the most of this time to encourage you to finish reading the Think Club questions. It's for the Jewish Book Club, which is next Ora Torah on the 22nd of April. There's nothing next week because it's going to be Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut. So Monday we've got our first Jewish Book Club. Yes, so just a reminder.
Thank you.
I'll get you a glass.
Oh, thank you.
We're on the diaspora over there. It's just like I have to sort of hear and concentrate.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you
So,
want to sort of move a bit more to the middle?
Yeah, because I will.
Because I'm not sure. I know the picture.
Okay, so I should say there?
Well, a bit more towards the middle.
Okay,
It would be
yeah.
lovely for our corner anyway. People might think they've lost you then, of course.
It's okay. It's okay. I may stay here. Okay. Good evening. Now we are talking about Italian Jews. Closer? Okay. Okay. I'll start with a little play on words, and I say nomen and omen. In a name, there's always another meaning. And if we take the name Italia and we write it in Hebrew, we split it in three parts. We have Italia. I means island, Tal, dew, and Ya is one of the name of God. And so island or divine dew. I haven't invented this. It was actually something Italian Jews have always kept in their hearts, and they always seen the name of their country as a good omen, a land filled with blessing. And I reminded the second blessing of the Amidah, where we pray for dew. Sorry. And Jews have been in Italy for a long time. And in the first book of the Maccabees, which is not in the Tanakh, but it's very important for the history of Israel, we find this text. Now Judas heard of the fame of the Romans, that whosoever had come to them, they made enmity with them. So Judas chose Eupolemus, the son of John, the son of Jacob, and Jason, the son of Eleazar, and he sent them to Rome to make a league of enmity and confederacy with them. And they went to Rome, a very long journey. And they entered into the Senate house and said, Judas Maccabeus and his brethren, and the people of the Jews have sent us to you to make alliance and peace with you. And that we may register as your confederates and friends. And the proposal was pleasing in their sight. And that was around in 160 BCE. And around that time, Palestine became a confederate sort of state of the growing Roman Empire. So Jews have been in Italy for at least 2,200 years, and probably even before that. And there were free, probably merchants or traders. And for a little while things were good, but then in around 60 BCE, Pompeius conquered Palestine. It became not a friend state, but a sort of like a slave state. So that started a Roman domination of Eretz Israel. And as we all know, on Tisha B'Av, on the 70 of the current era, there were sort of troubles in Palestine and about paying taxes, and the Romans invaded and they took over and they destroyed the second temple, and that was the end of a long history for a long time. And after that, many Jews were taken as slaves to Rome, and we see this bas-relief from the Titus, the Arch of Titus in Rome, and we see some Jewish slaves taking menorah and the Torah scroll into Rome as a spoil from that time. So that marked an influx of Jews in Italy, and that founded the original core of Italian Jews. And Italian Jews of that time are not Ashkenazim and they're not Sfardim, but they're called Italkim. And they've lived in Italy for at least 2 millennia, and they're a rite which is quite different from the Ashkenazi rite and from the Sephardi rite. And some of the prayers, some of the rituals are quite close to the rituals of the Romagnons, which are the original Greek Jews, which came to Greece probably 2,500 years ago, more or less. So that's why there's this similarity. And they, in some aspects, still nowadays, prayers are more related to how Judaism was practiced in Eretz Israel than how it was practiced in Babylonia. So more close to the Talmud of Yerushalayim than to the Babylonian Talmud. And nowadays they follow the halakha of the Shulchan Aruch, but following the Sephardi tradition and not the Ashkenazi tradition. I thought at a certain point they had to choose one of the legislations, and they went for the Sephardi ones. And so for a long time, Jews were in Italy, and they were sort of free citizens. They didn't sort of were sort of persecuted or expelled. And I just found a little sort of funny episode. There was one Jew, a famous Kabbalist, Abraham Abulafia. He was Spanish, but he went to Italy and he tried to convert the Pope. And just before, the day before Rosh Hashanah of 1280, he went to Rome, he wanted to convert the Pope, and they said, the Pope is not here, he's in another palace. He went to the other palace, and when he entered the gate, they told him the Pope had died the night before. So that was the end of the try to convert the Pope to Judaism. But things became more troubled around the 1200s, 1300s. And this map is a map of the migrations forced, really, by expulsions, more or less between the year 1000 to 1500s. And you can see in this map that there are a lot of arrows going out of, for example, England, coming to France, going out of France, going out of Spain, going out of northern Germany. And there are a lot of arrows going into Italy, and there are no arrows coming out of Italy. And this is quite interesting because at that time Jews were expelled from many parts of Europe, but not from Italy. And they, so naturally, they tried to find another country where to go, and they, quite a few went to Italy. And I will sort of explore a little bit some of those in a sense, movements of Jews towards Italy. I will start with troubles in France. They sort of started around the 1100s, at the time of the First Crusades, and that caused a lot of slaughter of Jews, like in the region of the Rhine. And French Jews were still okay, but the situation got worse and worse. And then King Philip IV in 1306 expelled the Jews from France, and the reason was usually the same. The king didn't have a lot of money left, so it was a good way of getting money in from his point of view. So expelled the Jews, and they can only live with a little bit of money, and they seized all their properties. And the same thing happened more or less a century later in 1394, when King Charles VI ordered the expulsion of the Jews from France. Jews had come back to France after the expulsion by Philip, but then they were expelled by King Charles. And some of the French Jews crossed the Alps and went into Italy. And they formed an interesting community. It's called the Apam Jews, and I will say exactly what this name Apam means. So there were Ashkenazi Jews from France, and the interesting thing is that French Jews were following the form of sort of Ashkenazi tradition as put forward by Rashi. But then around the 1400s, they accepted the Ashkenazi tradition coming from Germany. But this small community of French Jews which went to Italy, they kept the previous tradition. So they remained the only Jewish community in the world to follow the Ashkenazi tradition according to Rashi and not according to sort of the German or Eastern European tradition. And the name Apam comes from an acronym. So the Jews, this small group of Jews crossed the Alps, and they ended up in three places: Asti, Fossano, and Moncalvo, which are three sort of minor centers near Turin. And if you take the Hebrew letters of the initials of the name Asti, Fossano, and Moncalvo, you have the acronym APAM. So in Italy we had Italkim, the original sort of Italian Jews, and then we start having an Ashkenazi community coming into Italy. And more or less at the same time, it's actually interesting, in 1455 the printing press was invented by Gutenberg, and soon after the first Hebrew books were printed. And we all know the Soncino press house, and actually Soncino is the name of a small place in Lombardy, the region I come from. And this family of Jewish printers, the Soncino family, were the first to print the first complete Tanakh in the world. And a few years later, they printed a complete edition of the Talmud that we still use nowadays. There's other editions, but that is one of the ones which is still here nowadays. And I just put a red dot. It's actually the place where I come from. I thought it was interesting to show where I come from. So I come from northern Italy, not far away from the border with Switzerland, just northwest of Milan. So we had troubles in France, and then century later we had troubles in Spain. They started again when the Crusaders came to Spain in 1212, and then century later massacres of Jews were widespread in Spain, and in 1492 King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, they signed this edict of expulsion. So all Jews in Spain were expelled, or if they wanted to stay, they had to convert. So quite a few fled Spain. Some went, then after a little while they went to America, and some went to Italy, some went to sort of Turkey, Greece, and they went to what would have been the coast of Yugoslavia. So at this time before we had Ashkenazim from France coming to Italy, and now we have a big group of Sephardi Jews coming and establishing themselves in Italy. Some directly from Spain, so we had a group of Spanish Sfardim, but we also a group of Levantine Sfardim, which are Spanish Jews which went to Turkey, for example, or they went to the coast of the Adriatic Sea on the sort of like Balkan side, and which then at the time was under the control of Venice. So they settled there and then they moved to Italy. So they came through an indirect way, but they were slightly different communities. So we have Spanish Sfardim and Levantine Sfardim. But as I said, there were only arrows coming into Italy, but really there was a big arrow which was going from south to north. So around in the 1500s, you can see on this map, the red dots are major Jewish communities in Italy. So because Jews had come for like 2,000 years ago, and they settled in southern Italy and then in Rome, it was natural that most Jews lived in southern Italy. And there were a lot of communities in Sicily, for example. You can see the huge number of red dots, and then communities in southern Italy, and not many actually in central and northern Italy. And some sources say that actually in Sicily there were 100,000 Jews, which is a huge number. But unfortunately, Sicily was directly under the control of Spain in 1492, and southern Italy was under indirect control of Spain. So when the expulsion of Jews happened in Spain, automatically there was an expulsion of Jews from Sicily, and a few decades later an expulsion of Jews from southern Italy. So the net effect was that Jews went from Sicily to central and northern Italy. They went from southern Italy to central and northern Italy, plus Jews coming from France, from Spain, Jews coming from the Levantine regions, and they all settled in, many settled in Venice, Modena, Ferrara, which are south of Milan, Livorno and Pisa, which are near Florence. So they founded big Sephardic communities at that time, and they actually they flourished, and especially in Venice. And in Venice, the first printed Sephardi Siddur was produced, and Venice became a little bit the cultural capital for the world Sephardim in the world, and then later on it moved, I think, to Amsterdam. And I find very interesting these pictures. These pictures are from Venice. And in Venice, in a small area, you can actually find several synagogues. And you can find still the Italian synagogue for the Italian king, and the Spanish synagogues for the Spanish Sfardim, a Levantine synagogue for the Levantine Sfardim, and then you can find a German synagogue for the Ashkenazim, which had been started to come from Eastern Europe and settling in Venice, settling in Trieste near the border with nowadays Slovenia. So we really have like a melting pot of Jews in Italy through the ages, and but unfortunately Venice was the cultural sort of capital for the Sfardim. But in 1518, the first ever ghetto was established, and I think the rulers of Venice were a little bit frightened by the number of Jews which had arrived in Venice, and they ordered the Jews to live just in one suburb, and there's this map of this suburb. And this suburb, there used to be a foundry, and so a foundry in the dialect of Venice was called ghetto, which is actually similar to the modern Italian getto, which is like a jet, like a cast of molten metal. So if you take ghetto, which is the dialect word for nickname for a foundry, and then because they were Ashkenazi Jews, they had a hard pronunciation of the first G, G, so Ghetto became ghetto, and from ghetto, nowadays the word we use ghetto. And little by little in the following century, ghettos were established in other cities in Italy and throughout Europe. And in Venice, the Jews had restrictions, but it was quite a wealthy community, so the situation wasn't too bad. But for example, in Rome, it was quite a poor community, and in many other cities, the conditions were quite terrible. And in 1555, the Pope wrote this letter, Cum Nimis Absurdum, which actually jump-started the creation of ghettos throughout Europe. And they said that we have to limit their freedom and their movements. And in Italy, very importantly, in 1848, part of Italy was unified by the King of Piedmont, and in 1848 he wrote a constitution which is called the Statuto Albertino. And in that constitution there were rights for every citizen. So at that time, even Jews that for centuries had limited freedom suddenly were free citizens. And you can see that the ghetto in Turin was demolished in 1848, exactly the same year when the Jews got sort of rights, freedom rights. And then in 1861, for example, in Ancona, because at that time the Kingdom of Italy annexed the Papal State, and so this constitution came into effect, so the ghetto disappeared. And then in 1870, finally Rome was annexed to the Kingdom of Italy, and that was the end of the ghetto in Rome, which was the very last ghetto to still survive in Europe at that time. So that was the very end. And unfortunately, we all know that in the 20th century, other ghettos came back. So in 1860, which is actually the date we take for the reunification of Italy, which for a long time had been a collection of different states, you can see there are big Jewish communities in Rome, Florence, Livorno, Venice, the place that we have seen before for historic reasons. No Jewish communities in southern Italy, no Jewish communities in Sicily. And it's still the case nowadays. Hardly any Jew lives in southern Italy. And I thought to have an intermezzo in the sort of historical description of the history of Jews in Italy, and look at some of the particular aspects of the Italian rite. And I'd like to start with probably what we have most dear, Torah scroll. And when we read from the Torah, usually we cantillate. And the Italian tradition is a spatial cantillation, and I will play a short clip. It is from the first Aliyah from Bereshit. And pay attention to the last Erev. By Erev, by Boker, there is a very strange pronunciation.
Oh. I have to make the volume up.
Sorry. Sorry. Sorry for the interruption. this cantillation is nowadays hardly heard in Italy, because in Rome they use a Sephardic cantillation. It's probably only used in Milan and Turin. And you can see a very simple sort of wavy pattern going up and down, up and down. Someone said quite monotonous, but I think it's quite hypnotic cantillation. And it was probably hard to hear, but it was probably hard to hear, but the Italian Jews have a slightly different pronunciation of Hebrew, and the most interesting thing, they pronounce a I as a n or as a n, which is quite different from what we say. So they say, instead of saying erev, they say ungerev, which is quite unique among Hebrew pronunciations among different communities. And then I said the Italian rite is no Ashkenazi, no, say, quite distinct. And I will just play maybe 10 seconds of one prayer one prayer that we say during the high holidays, and which is called Nidre, but you will hear that actually it's not exactly called Nidre, but something slightly different. And we usually sing Kol Nidre, but in the Italian rite they usually use an Hebrew version. So we use an Aramaic version, but in the Italian Siddur for the high holidays, it's actually a more antique version of Kol Nidre, and probably Kol Nidre is a translation of the Hebrew version. And it's a little bit of a remnant of this old rite. This one? Okay. And of course, like every good Jewish story, there's to be food. So there's quite a rich tradition of Jewish Italian recipes. And I put a picture of something that I actually cooked. I prepared and cooked. And there's actually pumpkin ravioli, which is a specialty from Mantova, which is a specialty of my region. So we said Italy is a little bit a Jewish melting pot. We have Italkim, we have the Sephardim, we have Ashkenazim, we have these Apam Jews, and then we have a very interesting community. This will be my last story for the night, and it's the story of the Jews of San Nicandro. So they're something completely different, and I think it's a story of hope in the midst of dark years. San Nicandro is a tiny place in sort of on the eastern coast of southern Italy, where there's a sort of promontory. And in this little place, someone very interesting was born in 1885, called Donato Mangiuzio. He was quite a poor person. He humble shoemaker, and he was sent to fight during the First World War, and he was wounded. And he spent months in a military hospital, and he couldn't read, couldn't write before he went to the war. But when he was in hospital, during the months he spent there, he learned how to read, which was actually quite something unusual, because analphabetism was rampant in southern Italy. Almost no one could read or write. So when he came back to the village, he could read. So, because he could read, one day, a few decades later, in 1930, he had a dream. He dreamed that it was a night, and he saw someone with a lantern, and the lantern was not lit up. And this person asked him if he had a lighter. And he said, "Oh, I don't have a lighter." But actually looked in his hands, and he had a match. And the match was already lit. So he lit the lantern. And the following day, so he had this strange dream, and the following day he met someone, and someone said, "Oh, you can read, and I have this book that someone gave me." And the book was a Bible. And so he started reading the Bible, and he finally had a revelation. Because he read stories about shepherds, he had stories about the story that we know in the Torah, and of oppression. And he said, he was raised Catholic, and he said, if the Messiah has arrived, we shouldn't be in this situation. We shouldn't be oppressed. We shouldn't be poor shepherds and still live in the same situation. So what they told me is probably not right. And he had this this vision, that the religion which was told in the Torah, he had a mission to revive it. And he had never met a Jew in his life. And as we said, in southern Italy, Jews were expelled in the 1500s and they hadn't come back. So he never met any Jew, he had never heard of any Jewish communities, and actually he thought that they were all dead. That story was an old story, and that religion had died away. And his mission was to bring back the religion. So he started preaching his form of Judaism to his friends and relatives. And so they started living, we can say, a Jewish life without having a Siddur, without having a Talmud, without having anything. But just having what was written in Torah. They kept Shabbat, they kept the festivals, which were described in the Torah. So they didn't have Hanukkah, for example, but they had all the other festivals. And then finally one day someone came to the village, a merchant, and he saw this strange community, and he said, "Oh, but actually the Jews are not dead. The cities are full of them. And if you go to Rome, there are thousands of them." So he wrote to the rabbi in Rome, and he said, "We are a Jewish community, and we want to make contact with another Jewish community." And the rabbi in Rome thought it was a joke. And he didn't reply for 3 times or 4 times. But finally, they kept pushing, they kept insisting, and the rabbi in Rome sent someone to San Nicandro, and he thought that he was astonished to find a community that he never heard about. And so the situation was tense, because then the Second World War came, it was a fascist time, and deportation started in 1943, so it wasn't a time to convert to Judaism. But the community in Rome finally decided that this people was worth converting. And the San Nicandro Jews, I titled this slide Jews ex nihilo, because really they came out of nowhere. And it's sort of autonomous conversion in a sense. And they had a prayer, and the community of Rome were very good. They sent Sidurim, they sent Talitot. And then during the Second World War, there was actually Palestinian group of soldiers which fought in Italy with the Allies, and they went to that community in San Nicandro, and they saw that some people had some sort of these flags with a Maccabee. So they stopped, and they sort of helped this community, and they told them about the Palestine, and that there were Jews in Palestine, and they started having the idea to sort of migrate to Palestine. So after the war, the rabbi went, converted the Jews in San Nicandro, and most of them made Aliyah in around 1950. And they now live in Sfat and around that area, the descendants of the San Nicandro Jews. But it's actually, I will finish with this, the last picture, this picture of a group of women. Because some of those original Jews didn't convert, and some didn't make Aliyah to Israel. So there's still a group of Jews in San Nicandro. And what's interesting, they are all women. Because this developed the male children, they would marry out, and the sort of female children, they would pass on the tradition, the Jewish tradition, to their children. So nowadays they are sort of mainly women, but they still keep Shabbat. They keep Shabbat. They do all the festivals and everything as they should. So I wanted to finish with this story about this melting pot in Italy, but this story of sort of hope and very strange. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions or? Yeah?
You said that a rabbi came to convert the San Nicandro Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Weren't they Jews?
Sorry?
Weren't they Jews? So what? How?
Oh,
Why?
no, because halachically they weren't Jews because there were no Jews in that village. It is only because of the sort of vision of this.
So the Bible he read
Yeah.
was just thankfully an Old Testament and not a new one?
No, it was actually like a Christian Bible with the Old Testament and New Testament. But as I said, Donato Manduzzo was raised as a Catholic. But he had never read the Bible because at the time almost no one could read, and he had just to follow what the priest was saying. And then when he got the Bible, he read the New Testament, he read the Old Testament, and then he realized, well, he had this idea that the Messiah had never arrived. So he rejected the New Testament, and he only sort of, in a sense, studied the Old Testament, studied the Torah, if we can call it in that way. And it's from reading the Bible that he took keep the Shabbat, the commandments, and the festivals. So he didn't have anything. He didn't have any books, any Siddurim, anything. It's just reading the Bible. He revived in a sense. It's a little bit like the Kare Jews, which don't follow the Talmud and they just follow the Torah. In a sense, it was a kind of strange form of Judaism. But
did you hear anything about do you know anything about the Jews of Siciliano? So I put a book of Jewish Italian cuisine.
yes, probably.
Yeah, sort of out from Siciliano.
I really don't know sort of details about the specific community, but because it should be near Florence,
Yeah.
so it is probably like a Sephardi community, because around Livorno, Pisa, around that region, quite a few Sephardi Jews sort of went and established themselves. So they probably arrived around the 1500s, maybe. Just a guess. Just a guess.
I can tell you a little comment on Siciliano.
Mm-hmm.
When Yuri and I had a chance to travel to Italy, which was my dream, I researched for Jewish history and life in Tuscany and found Siciliano, which is an absolutely amazing place. From one side, when you come, you just see these huge mountains, or like looking at Masada. It turns out you can drive from the other side. The Jewish community is still active, very tiny. It's carved into the mountain, so the rooms of the community are like made of just a mountain wall. They have a shul, and we went to a little restaurant, and I was telling the lady that was serving us that we're from New Zealand, and she said, "Oh, I know someone from New Zealand." He's teaching at the university. I said, Giovanni. Giovanni's mother lives there.
Giacomo.
Giacomo. Sorry. Yeah, Giacomo. Like, it was like incredible, to come there and know someone that was living there. He grew up there. It's beautiful. If you have a chance. Amazing place.
Yeah. Oh.
I want perspective for explaining about different Italian communities, because I've recently
Christ stopped at Epoli.
Yes.
And that is, so it seems to have been an idea, which is a place in Sicily, and it seems to have been an idea that Christ did not arrive. It seems an idea that must have been around somehow because this man had it, and so the book is called that.
Cristo si è fermato a Empoli.
That they felt so abandoned.
Yeah, it's quite tragic, the sort of the story of the Jews in southern Italy. Because I think nowadays there's some rabbis and some cultural centers which are trying to actually try to make aware people from Sicily and southern Italy of the Jewish past, which has been completely forgotten because most people don't know anything about the fact. And I said, some sources said there were 100,000 Jews in Sicily, not 10. So, but yeah.
Well, at least I can't say that it's not yet.
No.
Let them not take it from me.
Kelvin, did you have a question?
Yes. I was just wondering if you could just fast forward a bit and tell us a little bit about Mussolini, the relationship between the Jews of Italy under Mussolini. I've come across references that Mussolini was not a Nazi, not perhaps an anti-Semite, but Italian Jews were deported to the camps. So how did the Jews fare under Mussolini?
Essentially, Mussolini came into power like in the 1920s, so he was there for a long time. And then when he had this terrible pact with Hitler, he was in a sense obliged to put racial laws against Jews. But before that, Jews could go to school, be at university, and own shops and buildings. And then he had to put in, at the end of the 1930s, those racial laws. So many Jews lost their work, but still they weren't at least persecuted in a sense to be sent to concentration camps. And he actually, for quite a while, he resisted from sending Jews to concentration camps. And also there was a little bit of distinction because there were Italian citizens, and Jews who weren't Italian citizens, and they were sort of treated in different ways. But then in September 1943, the fascist government signed an armistice with the Allies. So in northern and central Italy, suddenly the Germans became the occupiers. So southern Italy was free in a sense, and then Nazis were in northern and central Italy, and they started deporting Jews. So it maybe happened when, like from Rome, 1,000 Jews were deported, and there were sort of slaughters of Jews in many other places. But until then, the situation was bad, but not as bad as in many other European places. So he had to discriminate, but in a sense he didn't quite as efficiently exterminate Jews. It's only in September 1943 that things changed completely because suddenly Italy was the enemy of the Nazis and not the ally anymore. So.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you very much, Stephen and Luca, for kicking off our series of lectures on diaspora Jewry. If I remember correctly, we have Leon Ben Baruch, who will come down from Wanganui to speak more about Sephardi Jews. We'll have my mom, Desiree, speak about Venezuelan Jewry. Yoel is speaking on Indian Jews, and we also have a talk on Argentinian. No. Okay, so we still have, and then we have Anne Beaglehall talking more about the history of New Zealand Jews later on in the series as well. So, yes, as you can see, Ora Torah is a mixture of academic, religious, anthropological, and cinematographic, and Jewish subjects. Next time, we don't have Ora Torah next week because it's Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, but the 22nd of April, it's our first book club session. Linda Young had the idea of starting this book club, so please do your homework and read the book. It's very good by Howard Jacobson, The Fickler Question. Don't worry if you haven't finished reading it, please come anyway, it's worth the read. And so I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.